We are in presentation number 8 of the Trail of Blood, and I'm going to just really jump right into it. This will wind up the second period of time that Dr. Carroll has talked about. The first period was from the formation of the church up until about 100 AD. And now we've considered about 100 to 500 AD. And the first 3 churches of the 7 churches of Asia were included in that first time period. And actually Pergamos extended a little over into 500s, but be that as it may, it's still a good fit. So what I'm going to do this morning is go back to Dr. Carroll's text, and we're going to finish up that age period, because beginning with 600, we'll go through another period, and we're going to find ourselves getting into the Dark Ages, which are really, really dark by every means of church history and even secular history involved. Without further ado, we'll continue on here with the Trail of Blood, and I'll pick up with Dr. Carroll's text. Thus it will be noted that during the first 3 centuries, 3 important and vital changes from the teachings of Christ and his apostles had their beginnings. And one significant event took place. Now, he's going to recap. Notice this summary and recapitulation. The change, number 1, from the New Testament idea of bishop and church government. In other words, a pastor and a church. And of course, the word bishop, as we know from the scriptures, is interchangeable with the word pastor. But now the Catholics are beginning to take this word bishop and make something else out of it that the scriptures did not have. This change grew rapidly, more pronounced, and complete and hurtful. Number 2, the change from the New Testament teachings as to regeneration to baptismal regeneration. In other words, of being saved by grace through faith, not of works, lest any man should boast, according to the scriptures. It became, you have to be baptized in order to be saved. I'm sure that you realize now that the majority of denominations today and churches today connect baptism with salvation, except True Baptists. And there are a few others that do not, but they are rare. There's one branch of which I was surprised to find out years and years ago. There's one branch of the Church of Christ that does not believe in baptismal regeneration. Yeah, I didn't know that. And I expressed this to this Church of Christ preacher in my first mission work. And this fellow told me, we got on the subject of baptism, and this fellow told me, he said, let me tell you. He said, we don't baptize anybody that comes into this church unless they have made a profession of faith in Christ and they are saved. I said, wow, I've never heard a Church of Christ preacher say that before. He said, well, there is a branch of us that do believe that. And up the road, not 5 miles away, was another Church of Christ church that believed right the opposite. They believed that you had to make a profession of faith in Christ. However, you had to be baptized in order to complete salvation. You can see how that this heresy has, even today, is still predominant in the religious world. Now, there are a few Pentecostals that do not believe in baptismal regeneration. They have the salvation part right, but then they go off on some other things. But you'll find that the majority of those who believe in Ephesians 2:8-9, for by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast, is Baptist, far and above. A few others, but primarily Baptist. All right, back to Dr. Carroll's text now. Number 3, the change from believer's baptism to infant baptism. And this last, however, did not become general nor even very frequent for another century, but it was introduced Infant baptism was introduced. So we have baptismal regeneration and infant baptism, number 10. These two errors have, according to the testimony of well-established history, caused the shedding of more Christian blood as the centuries have gone by than all other errors combined, or than possibly have all wars not connected with persecution if you leave out the recent world war, quote unquote. Now, we need to remember that Dr. Carroll was writing this in the late 20s or early 30s, and World War I had only been over for just a few years. So it was that period of time in American history from World War I to World War II that Dr. Carroll was writing. World War I was supposed to have been the war to end all wars. Of course, we know that didn't happen. So I wanted to give that little explanation when he says the recent world war. So we have to keep in mind when he was writing this. Over 50 million Christians died martyr deaths, mainly because of their rejection of these two errors during the period of the Dark Ages alone, about 12 or 13 centuries. Let me add here a sort of a personal note. Some of the biggest battles that I have fought in my ministry, and especially during mission work, is on scriptural baptism. I always question people, especially in mission work. I always question people when they would come. They would want to join our work, and I would say, okay, I would go through salvation. Well, we've been saved. Okay, then I would go through baptism. Well, we've been baptized. Well, tell me about it. 9 times out of 10, we could not accept it. And because that I questioned their baptism, many of them thought I was questioning their salvation. They could not separate salvation from baptism. And we lost many people because I was adamant on that stand. We've been baptized one time, that's enough. Well, not if it's not scriptural. Many times there were people who would stop coming when they found out that we would not accept their baptism. But I am of the opinion from a study of the scriptures that if a church will accept alien baptism, so to speak, in other words, any baptism that is unscriptural, I'm of the opinion, and I may be wrong, this is Robert's theology, okay, I can't prove beyond the shadow of a doubt, I think I have standing in the scriptures, I think then that makes that church become unscriptural. Because church perpetuity is through baptism, not the name. That's the reason baptism is so important. All right, I'll get off soapbox. Number 11, 3 significant facts for a large majority of many churches are clearly shown by history during these first 3 centuries. Number 1, the separateness and independence of the churches. Number 2, the subordinate character of bishops or pastors. And number 3, the baptism of believers only. A person has to be old enough, and the Bible does not set an age, by the way. Person has to be old enough to acknowledge that they are a sinner and accept Jesus Christ as their Savior, and be able to publicly state so before they are a candidate for baptism. And then I take it one step farther. When I get them in the baptistry, I question them again. Anybody that comes, when I've been a pastor, anybody that comes down the aisle and talks to me, unless I have already talked with them, and they want to be a member of the church that I pastor, I go into their baptism. I go into salvation. I question them on their salvation. I question them on their baptism. And if they don't have that second one right, well, I'm sorry, you can come, but you're going to come as a candidate for baptism. Most of the time I've known when somebody is going to come for membership, and I've been able to discuss that ahead of time with them. And I've even checked where they've had their baptism to try and determine as much as possible if it was scriptural. And there are times that you cannot determine completely. You have to take their testimony. But if they have said the right things and they've answered those questions properly, there is no way that I can read their heart or you can read their heart that they're not telling the truth, and you have to accept what they say. Then the onus of the proof is on them and not the church. Even Jesus had a member that was lost. Did that make that first church unscriptural? No, it did not. Even though Jesus knew about Judas. Judas was there under false pretenses. So if a person answers the right questions and even provides the adequate document, hence that is a letter from another church, fellowshipping church, or a church of like faith and order, if they are lost and they do not have scriptural baptism, then the onus is on them. It's not the church, but the church, as we say today, has done its due diligence. Back to Dr. Carroll, number 12. He says, I now quote from Motion, the greatest of all Lutheran church historians, volume 1, pages 71 and 72. All of this now, from this point for a little bit, is a quote, direct quote. But whosoever supposes that the bishops of this golden age of the church correspond with the bishops of the following centuries must blend and confound characters that are very different. For in this century and the next, a bishop had charge of a single church, which might ordinarily be contained in a private house. Nor was he its lord, but was in reality its minister or servant. All the churches in those primitive times are independent bodies, or none of them subject to the jurisdiction of any other. He continues, for though the churches were founded by the apostles themselves frequently, had the honor shown to them to be consulted in doubtful cases, yet they had no judicial authority, no control, no power of giving laws. On the contrary, it is as clear as the noonday that all Christian churches had equal rights and were in all respects on a footing of equality, unquote. Dr. Kerr continues in number 13, up to this period, notwithstanding much and serious persecutions, Christianity has had a marvelous growth. It has covered and even gone beyond the great Roman Empire. Almost, if not all, the inhabited world has heard the gospel. And according to some church historians, many of the original churches organized by the apostles are yet intact and yet loyal to apostolic teachings. However, as already shown, a number of very marked and hurtful errors have crept in and gotten permanent hold among many of the churches. Some have become very irregular. Number 14, persecutions have become increasingly bitter. Near the beginning of the 4th century comes possibly the first definite government edict of persecution. The wonderful growth of Christianity has alarmed the pagan leaders of the Roman Empire. Hence, Calerius, the emperor, sent out a direct edict of a more savage persecution. This occurred February the 24th, 303 AD. Up to this time, paganism seems to have persecuted without any definite laws to that effect. 15. But this edict failed so utterly in its purpose of stopping the growth of Christianity that this same emperor, Calerius, just 8 years thereafter, at AD 311, passed another edict recalling the first and actually granting toleration. In other words, permission to live the religion of Jesus Christ. It had the opposite effect, which persecution usually does. This was probably its first favorable law. Number 16, by the beginning of the year AD 313, Christianity has won a mighty victory over paganism. A new emperor has come to the throne of the Roman Empire. He evidently recognized something of the mysterious power of this religion that continued to grow in spite of persecution. History says that this new emperor was none other than Constantine, who had a wonderful, realistic vision. Yeah, probably Satan gave it to him. He saw in the skies a fiery red cross, and on that cross, written in fiery letters, these words: "By this thou shalt conquer." He interpreted it to mean that he should become a Christian, and that by giving up paganism and that by attaching the spiritual power of the Christian religion into the temporal power of the Roman Empire, the world would be easily conquered. Thus, the Christian religion would in fact become a whole world religion, and the Roman Empire a whole world empire. So, number 17, under the leadership of Emperor Constantine, there comes a truce, a courtship, and a proposal of marriage. The Roman Empire, through its emperor, seeks a marriage with Christianity. Give us your spiritual power, and we will give you our temporal power, he says. Number 18, to effectually bring about and consummate this unholy union, a council was called. In AD 313, a call was made for a coming together of the Christian churches or their representatives. Many, but not all, came. The alliance was consummated. A hierarchy was formed. In the organization of the hierarchy, Christ was dethroned as the head of the churches, and Emperor Constantine enthroned, only temporarily, however, as the head of the church. 19. The hierarchy was a definite beginning of a development which finally resulted into what is now known as the Catholic or universal church. Catholic means universal. It might be said that its indefinite beginnings were near the close of the 2nd and beginning of the 3rd century, when the new ideas concerning bishops and preacher church government began to take place. In other words, preachers began to gain more and more power, and the church losing less and less of its authority. Number 20, let it be definitely remembered that when Constantine made his call for the council, there were many of the Christians, Baptists, if you will, and of the churches which declined to respond. They wanted no marriage with the state, no centralized religious government, and no higher ecclesiastical government of any kind than the individual church. These Christians, Baptists, nor the churches ever at that time or later entered the hierarchy of the Catholic denomination. So we are not Protestants. We never came out of the Catholic Church. If the truth be told, the Catholics came out of us. Number 21, when this hierarchy was created, Constantine, who was made its head, was not himself at that time a Christian. He had agreed to become one. But as the erring or irregular churches which had gone with him into this organization had come to adopt the error of baptismal regeneration, a serious question arose in the mind of Constantine. He said, if I am saved from my sins by baptism, what is to become of my sins which I may commit after I am baptized? You see how far away from the truth they had gotten. He raised the question which has puzzled the world in all succeeding generations, except, may I say, for Baptists. Can baptism wash away yet uncommitted sins? Can't wash away any of them. You're right. Or are the sins committed prior to baptism washed away by one method, that is baptism, and the sins committed subsequent to baptism washed away by another method? You see how convoluted it became? When you get off on one point, it just goes from there. Open communion does not make a church unscriptural. It opens the door for more error to come in. And it may take generations, but eventually that church will no longer be a scriptural church. Let me back up and put it a little bit more bluntly. If you change the scriptures, I'm saying, if you stop using the King James Version, which has been tried and proven and tested for hundreds and hundreds of years, if you begin using another version of Scriptures, you have opened the door a little crack. And it's not long, something else comes up that's accepted. And first thing you know, you've got a church so far out in left field, you need a telescope to find it. 22. You see how that one compromise with the truth leads to another, that leads to another, that leads to another. And now we see the end result. No, we see the end result today. It was bad enough then. It's worse now. Not being able to settle satisfactorily the many questions thus arising, Constantine finally decided to unite with the Christians, but to postpone his baptism until just preceding his death, so that all his sins might thus be washed away at one time. This course he followed, and hence was not baptized until just preceding his death. 23. Constantine's action in repudiating for the Roman Empire the pagan religion and accepting Christianity incurred the hot displeasures of the Roman Senate. They repudiated, or at least opposed, his course, and their opposition finally resulted in the removal of the seat of empire from Rome to Byzantium, an old city rebuilt and then renamed Constantinople, or Constantine. As a result, there came to be two capital cities of the Roman Empire, Rome and Constantinople. And in fact, the Catholics are still divided today in your Greek Orthodox and your Roman Catholic. Not a whole lot difference in their beliefs, but there are a little bit, but not enough to separate them, unfortunately. The two rival cities several centuries later became the ruling centers of the divided Catholic Church, Roman and Greek. Still that way today. Not necessarily the city, but there's still the two branches. 24. Up to the organization of the hierarchy and the uniting of church and state, all the persecution of Christianity has been done either by Judaism or paganism. Now comes a serious change. Christians, in name, began to persecute Christians. Constantine, desiring to have all Christians join with him in his new idea of a state religion, and many conscientiously opposing this serious departure from the New Testament teachings, he begins using the power of government to compel. May I ask you what makes that any different than Islam? Very little. Thus began the days and years and even centuries of a hard and bitter persecution against all of those Christians who were loyal to the original Christ and apostolic teachings. 25. Remember that we are now noting the events occurring between the years AD 300 and 500. That 100 changes begin to creep in, as we have seen. The hierarchy organized under the leadership of Constantine rapidly deployed into what is now known as the Catholic Church. This newly developing church joined to a temporal government, no longer simply an executive to carry out the completed laws of the New Testament, began to be legislative, amending or annulling old laws or enacting new ones entirely unknown to the New Testament. 26. One of the first of its legislative enactments, and one of the most subversive in its results, was the establishing by law of infant baptism. By this new law, infant baptism becomes compulsory. This was done AD 416. Infants had been infrequently baptized for probably a century preceding this. Insofar as this newly enacted law became effective, two vital New Testament laws were abrogated: believers' baptism and voluntary personal obedience in baptism. 27. As an inevitable consequence of this new doctrine and law, These erring churches were soon filled with unconverted members. In fact, it was not very many years until probably a majority of the membership was composed of unconverted material. So the great spiritual affairs of God's great spiritual kingdom were in the hands of an unregenerate temporal power. What may now be expected? 28. Loyal Christians and churches, of course, rejected this new law. Believers' baptism, of course, New Testament baptism, was the only law for them. They not only refused to baptize their own children, but believing in the baptism of believers only, they refused to accept the baptizing done by and within the churches of this unscriptural organization. And we still do that today. If any of the members from the churches of this new organization attempted to join any of the churches which had refused to join in with the new organization, a Christian experience and a rebaptism was demanded. Not requested, demanded. 29. The course followed by loyal churches soon, of course, incurred the hot displeasure of the state religionists, many, if not most of whom, were not genuine Christians. The name Christian, however, was from now on denied those loyal churches who refused to accept these errors. They were robbed of that and called by many other names, sometimes by one and sometimes by another, Montanist, Tertullianist, Novationist, Patharines, etc. And some, at least because of their practice of rebaptizing those who were baptized in infancy, were referred to as Anabaptist, which literally means rebaptizers. 30. AD 426, just 10 years after the legal establishment of infant baptism, the awful period of the Dark Ages had its beginning. What a period. Awful, black, and bloody. From now on, for more than a decade of centuries, the trail of loyal Christianity is largely washed away in its own blood. And you can note on the chart for some of the many different names borne by the persecuted. Sometimes these names are given because of some special heroic leader, and sometimes from other causes. And frequently names for the same people vary in different countries and even in different centuries. The Montanists still have a church today, at least in Jamaica, and never had the opportunity to find out what they really believed. But unless they changed radically over the centuries, they were probably pretty close to what Baptists are today. But I could not quote that as a fact. 31. It was early in the period of the Dark Ages when real Popery had its definite beginnings. This was by Leo II, AD 440 to 461. This, however, was not the first time the title was ever used. This title, similar to the Catholic Church itself, was largely a development. The name appears as first applied to the Bishop of Rome, 296 to 304. Now, if you remember me stating at one point in the beginning, before the beginning of this, a split had come in the church at Rome in about AD 251. Prior to that, that church had been pretty scriptural. But here again, they lowered their guard and heresy began to creep in until those that were unregenerate or lost or believed by other means of salvation became the majority, and the real disciples, the real Christians, were booted out. So this bishop, this pastor, is now leading a false church. It was formally adopted by Syracuse, Bishop of Rome, in 384 to 398. Then officially adopted by Leo II, 440 to 461. Then claimed to be universal in 707. then some centuries later declared by Gregory the Seventh to be the exclusive right of the papacy. The 32 now, to sum up the most significant events of this first 5-century period. The gradual change from a democracy to a preacher-church government. That's the first. Number 2, the change from salvation by grace to baptismal salvation. Number 3, the change from believers' baptism to infant baptism. Number 4, the hierarchy organized, marriage of church and state. Number 5, the seat of empire changed to Constantinople. Number 6, infant baptism established by law and made compulsory. 7, Christians began to persecute Christians. And in fact, the latter Christians became known as heretics because they didn't agree with the heretical teachings of the Catholic Church. Number 8, the Dark Ages began in 426. Now, the official date may be different than that. We can use 426 as the beginning because that's really when the Catholic Church began to severely persecute true Christianity. The sword and torch, rather than the gospel, became the power of God unto salvation. All semblance of religious liberty dies and is buried and remains buried for many centuries. Number 11, loyal New Testament churches, by whatever name called, are hunted and hounded to the uttermost limit of the new Catholic temporal power. Remnants scattered over the world are finding uncertain hiding places in forests and mountains, valleys, dens, and caves of the earth. It has become very bloody indeed. In the next presentation, we will undertake the period Dr. Carroll considers, AD 600 to 1300. During that period, we'll also consider the 7 churches of Asia that fall into it. As a closing note, Jesus warned his disciples that persecution is part of loyally serving him. As 20th century children of God, we are now facing that for ourselves.